Good afternoon. This is DebraVWilson. It is Thursday, the 13th of September, 2018, and the time is 1700 hours and 6 minutes. That's GMT. That's approximate time. I'm in London, England. I think I've mentioned before I'm on an extended stay here in the UK. I'm doing field work around my research. Whilst I'm here in the UK, I'm exploring directions and focusing and a more nuanced and understanding of what I'm seeking to accomplish in my research. And to remind you, my three countries are Canada, Israel, and the UK, with the heart and soul of my research being understanding how civil society's impact with national security modeling or models impacts collective security for all. So how it impacts national security modeling. I am focusing specifically on feminist and women's expressions of activism. I'm trying to keep that focus to autonomous, organically emerging activism. I'm 61 years old. I started traveling here to the UK in my late 20s. And I always say the only trip I'm 100% sure I wasn't engaged in activism or working in an NGO was the very first trip. I was always focused on understanding how some aspect of security and how civilians experienced it. When I initially started traveling to the UK, that was women. It became more expansive post 9/11. And from a systemic analytical perspective, I sought to understand how and why the state did security modeling. In 2010, I had a brush with MI5 that was not pleasant for me. In 2011, I came back to the country and MI5 reached out again. I wasn't ready to talk. In the interim, I've traveled a bit. I was in Canada and for a wee bit in Israel. Always the impetus for my travels and my work and my research has always been, particularly for the last 20 plus years, understanding the ways in which national security models are constructed, understanding what goes into it from the state perspective, and how civilian organizations can and do impact that. For me, what happened to me in 2010, some of it I will share in my research, some of it's not appropriate to share in my research. The just that is very appropriate and pertinent to share is how a feminist civil society constructed security model intersected with the state's security model. I think because Britain is perpetually dealing with violence on her shores, that dynamic has produced vibrant activism of all iterations that feels quite comfortable opining on the ways in which the state constructs security. I think in Israel, it is the same thing. I want to say that I understand that there are a myriad of ways to construct how and why Israel and the UK in particular are experiencing perpetual security challenges. I am intentionally leaving that blank so you can come up to your own conclusion. The heart and soul of my research is how civilians respond, civil society in particular, with a focus on feminist and women's-based activism, how it responds to constructs of security by the state, and how those responses, what those responses do to national security modeling. Israel and the UK are rich spaces for such analysis because, again, they are perpetually under threat. Canada would appear to be the antithesis, but there is the issue of murdered, missing Indigenous women and girls, which is a segment of Canadian society that is perpetually under threat. So it is analogous on a micro level, not minimizing a particular identity of Canadian people, indeed the Indigenous people, who are perpetually under threat. But certainly in Canada, the vast majority of people on the place now called Canada would not view themselves as perpetually at risk for harm, which is very different than Israel and the United Kingdom. So I have an opportunity to look at a segment of society in Canada and look at the ways in which the state constructs security and the ways in which Indigenous women and girls experience that security and what activism has emerged out of those experiences. I think it's very important to, if you are so inclined, which I am, to understand you have a right to question national security modeling, to understand that there have to be safe ways for civilians to be able to engage with spies and spying apparatuses and still maintain our identity and our autonomousness as civilians. That's not always easy, because when you start poking at the national security modeling, I can guarantee you there's some things that are 100% certain. This would be one of them. Spies poke back. They start looking back. And that can be an interesting, in quotes, and complex set of dynamics, and it can be quite interesting. Nevertheless, I think you have to choose to endeavor on. I think it's important for civilians to understand the ways in which we experience the state's construction of ways in which to keep us safe. We have a right to lawfully respond, and that response should lead to some sort of discussion. I'm going to post the thumbnail for this later at a later date. And I'm taping this in my hotel room. I'm probably not going to, it's perfectly fine. This might be a one-off stay here, but nevertheless, it's not prudent for me to say where I'm at. So I'll post the thumbnail later. This is DebraVWilson, and I'm trying to work on, so the thing is, I'm looking at national security modeling. When I was in Canada, Canadian intelligence voiced their wish, that's very Canadian, that in my research that I maintain my identity as a civilian. And I don't want to put words in their mouth, but if that should change, then their way of engagement with me would change. So, and they were talking about intelligence agencies foreign to myself and foreign to them, or if I acted in a way that was no longer civilian behavior. So it's a similar dance that I need to do here in this country, the UK, and in Israel. So to the extent that I can post that journey, I certainly will, because it's something I'm learning. I'm looking to go back to Israel, specifically Haifa, but then to do some things in Tel Aviv. And again, you start poking around the national security model, spies poke back. So I need to make sure that I'm transparent and stay on the civilian side of the road in terms of both the UK intelligence community and Israel. So where I can post, I will post. This is Debra V. Wilson, and thank you for listening.